Once again, we're on Jimmy at the Crossroads in partnership with the Washington Examiner, where we cover a range of topics. And at the end of my conversation in the last segment with Michael Hiltzik, LA Times columnist, he made the argument that if we don't bail out states across the country, well, we will see a lot more unemployment. Is that the case? Should we begin bailing out New York and California and Illinois and other states that have overextended themselves and now are really facing it because of the coronavirus crisis? To talk about that, we're joined by Mark Mix, who is the chairman of the committee, the National Right to Work Committee. Mark Mix joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Mark, sir, welcome to the program.
Jimmy, good to be on with you. And I'm thinking to take that offer up on the Nick. Don't get nicked by Nick or whatever. That I shave a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's abundantly clear to me. But scruffyman.com, is a great place to go. So let me ask you this question, Mark. In the last segment, I was debating Michael Hiltzik about reopening in general. And then I wanted to get in a question so we could get a view that differs from you and me, arguing in favor of bailing out the states. The National Right to Work Committee argues not. He said unemployment will go up if you don't because you will have firefighters and policemen and healthcare workers out of work. What say you?
Well, look, they're looking for literally trillions of dollars to bail out the states that you mentioned, Jimmy: California, New York, Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey. And somehow they're trying to frame this in the context of the COVID-19 emergency or crisis, whatever we're calling it. And frankly, that's just not true. This is literally decades of mismanagement by these states. And particularly, it's decades of mismanagement when it comes to their government employees and how they basically run their government. In those states have been dealing with unionized government bureaucracies for literally decades. And that negotiation between politicians, who the unions on one hand contribute to get elected, and the politicians on the other hand that negotiate contracts with these same union officials, have caused this huge deficit in these states, and specifically the pension programs in these states that are basically bankrupt. I think New Jersey's like $130 billion short of what they need just to satisfy the promises they've made to retirees and current employees in that state. In California, the numbers are even bigger. In Illinois, we know they're on the brink of bankruptcy. So the notion that they come to Washington during this crisis, and they're taking Rahm Emanuel's advice, never let a good crisis go to waste, and trying to get the taxpayers from states that have been managed better, who have been more reasonable and conservative in their expenditures and dealing with their bureaucracies and their employees. And then yet they come and say, we're going to have to lay off teachers. So it's going to upset the children, because it's all about the children, Jimmy. You know that. And then first responders. When frankly, if you look at California, they have 345,000 government employees that make over $100,000 a year. Those aren't all the police and firefighters, I can assure you that. So this idea of a bailout, because we have this emergency, is something that I think is kind of whistling past the graveyard for a lot of these governors in these big states.
Yeah, to me, it seems like they were woefully unprepared for any sort of the coming due, if you will, of what's been happening for years and years, where it was fiscal mismanagement in all these states that you're mentioning, and they had no incentive to address it. In fact, this is what happens frequently for governments, is that until the crisis hits, they don't feel like they need to make any smart decisions. And now the crisis is hitting, and they want states like Colorado, for example, where I am, to bail out Illinois and New York.
Yeah, and your governor seems to be coming at this in a reasonable manner. I mean, frankly, of all the governors across the country, he's actually trying, I think, to get things reopened. And I think as a business person, he understands that those people that provide the oil that fills up the government oil jar every year through tax revenue, they're hurting just as bad as anybody else in this. And the fact is, and we know that state after state, and probably as we get into June, we'll see this, government revenues are going to be hit in a very big way. So there will be an emergency, but the idea that we had a bill, that they passed a bill last week that actually was a $3 trillion bill, of which $1 trillion was designated to go out to the states to bail them out. And then you had provisions like in Title VI of the bill that said any education money that would be doled out to the states would come with the requirement that they couldn't change any provisions in their union bargaining agreements. And then general provisions of the bill said in Title X that every contractor, subcontractor, and general contractor that does any work with federal money through this program has to pay union wages. Those are the types of things they slip into these bills that should make taxpayers' heads spin around and around and around.
When we look at the decision-making process of finances, by the way, relative to other Democratic governors, I give Governor Polis credit. But beyond that, I mean, that's a low bar to reach in my view. Beyond that, he's done a heck of a lot of things, like taking $1.6 billion in federal funds. A month ago, he said this legislature will determine how to spend it. He's allocating the money himself now. But that aside, when we look at a state like Colorado, one of the wonderful things here is that we're unique in having the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, which puts strict limits on government spending increases and on tax increases. You have to come to a vote of the people for tax increases, although they get around that by putting in new fees. But nevertheless, it provides greater restriction. And I wonder if a provision like Tabor might have helped some of these other states from getting into the level of a crisis and depth of a financial crisis that they seem to be in now, because it would have provided an incentive earlier on to address some of these issues, at least a little better.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jimmy. I mean, I remember back when Colorado led the way on Tabor and other states tried to do it. And I think union officials and politicians and government bureaucrats stood up and said, oh, my gosh, could they really, if this goes through, we could be limited in how big we can grow and how much money we can collect. So, yeah, there was definitely a pushback to that. I do remember those days. I forget how long ago that was. But certainly the idea of limiting government growth would be something that would have helped prepare these states for what's going on right now. No question about that.
What is your view, Mark Mix, again, president of the National Right to Work Committee? What is your view on bankruptcy, allowing states and cities to declare bankruptcy as an alternative to bailouts?
Yeah, well, certainly we know that cities, I mean, we had cities in California, I think 4 cities that filed bankruptcy there. There's a city in Alabama that's filed bankruptcy now. I think cities and localities, I think that way is clear. There remains a question about the pensions. And I think in California, one of the things, they separated the pensions from the government expenditures in these at the local level. And there was, for example, in Illinois, you have a constitutional provision that says you can't do anything to reform the pension system, which is outrageous. As far as a state filing bankruptcy, I mean, if it's a reorganization, that's one thing. But if it's this, we got to bail the whole state out, that's another problem. This notion that somehow the states are reliant on the federal government. When we started this whole experiment in self-government, Jimmy, we started out with the federal government being a ward of the states. And obviously, over the 200 plus years we've been going through this process, and the federal bureaucracy and government's grown bigger and bigger, we've got to a point where the balance has shifted now, that the states are coming. Literally, you've got a legislator in New Jersey saying, we're going to be on our knees begging the federal government to bail us out. You got legislators in Illinois, the Senate Majority Leader there, Don Harmon, indicating that he wants $41.9 billion of federal money. They want $15 billion with no strings attached. His words, not mine. These are the types of things that I don't think we should be rewarding and bailing out a state that's been irresponsible like Illinois. And it really gets to their pension issue specifically, Jimmy. They made these promises at the bargaining table that they knew they couldn't keep. It's kind of like John Maynard Keynes, we're all dead in the long run, so whatever we do in the short run doesn't matter. Right. Well, it matters now when revenues are dropping like a rock, and these pension obligations out there for workers who went to work, did their jobs, and said, here's what your pension's going to be. Those people are the ones that are going to be hurt the most, both in the private sector and certainly in the public sector. So from a state filing bankruptcy, I'm not sure how that would work and who would be responsible for putting them back on a financial footing that would allow them to operate again. I'm not sure I have a view on that or would support the federal government bailing out a state in that regard. But allowing them to file bankruptcy to reorganize, that might be something that take a deeper look at.
So the other day, I had a recommendation that came up on YouTube for a documentary from, I think it was the early 80s, that had an interview with Donald Trump, who, of course, was decades away from becoming president of the United States. And it was about New York City having been on the verge of going bankrupt in the 1970s. And then Mayor Ed Koch was in this documentary, and he said, look, we had to make decisions because we were on the brink, and we finally made those decisions, took the actions that we needed to take, and it put New York City on a better financial footing. And I felt that resonated with today because there was a particular threat that gave them the need, suddenly the sense of urgency, we've got to do something. They weren't going to get a bailout from the federal government. Instead, they had the prospect of maybe declaring bankruptcy. That's the kind of thing, that kind of urgency that politicians need. Otherwise, you have what's called a moral hazard, Mark Mix, where they feel every reason to just keep making the same mistakes and going down this path because they're going to be bailed out by somebody along the way. In fact, that's something we saw with the financial crisis is we had a lot of these, of 2008, a lot of these subprime mortgage loans were given out to borrowers who shouldn't have gotten them. And it was particularly because they felt and knew that the government, federal government, was going to be bailing them out.
Yeah, exactly right. Those banks, it was a moral hazard in bailing out because these banks were too big to fail, and the alleged destruction they would have caused if they would have been allowed to fail would have been too much for the financial system to handle. But on the state side, you're absolutely right. I think the New York model is a pretty interesting one. New York City, back in the 70s was governments have to make decisions. And, the definition of government in our system is this idea that they provide services that no one else can provide. They're a monopoly. Unfortunately, over the years, we've granted this monopoly a monopoly that union officials tend to orchestrate. And again, the cost of government, just those two examples I cited in the so-called HEROES Act that was passed in the House that probably is going nowhere in the Senate. But the fact that they would put those provisions saying you can't change any provision in the union contract means that you can't reform the system. And then they talk about, well, it's about the children and it's about the police officers and the firefighters. They lead with that. But if they just did let's say they just do the police function, they do the firefighting function, and they do the court system, those are the essential elements of government. Everything else, my gosh, they're involved in everything. And you're right. Forcing them to make hard decisions about how they run their governments is really, I think, the ultimate solution to this. And that comes when taxpayers understand the implications of what's happened. And I think they're going to get to see it in states like California and New York in Illinois, in Connecticut, in New Jersey, particularly those states that are in the most difficult financial positions at this time. We had a governor in Kentucky that tried to reform the pension system down there and did things that were really hard decisions. And politically, he paid a price for that, allegedly, in the last election. But the idea that he was trying to reform it and the pushback on just doing simple things that would make the pension system sustainable for maybe 10 or 15 additional years became such a political hot button that, most governors and elected officials, as you know, Jimmy, they don't want to deal with anything other than, the official congratulations to the state AAA champion or the official insect of the month or the official flower or cookie of the state. Those are easy things. When it comes to hard decisions like you talk about and looking at what they're doing and the services they're providing and the cost, they're loath to do that until they're actually at the edge, like Governor Koch or Mayor Koch said.
It's such an important point. And that's really the nature of politicians altogether, which is one of the reasons that I'm a big advocate of limited government. A final question for you on this topic, then I want to ask you about the current state of affairs for right to work in America. Is there anything else that you think people need to know fundamentally about this issue of bailing out the states that maybe isn't getting out there well enough when you do see someone who says no to bailing out the states out there making the case not to? Anything missing?
Yeah, I think it's this notion that somehow this crisis has caused this problem. I think letting people understand that this is not something that happened overnight. It didn't happen because of a virus that came from China. It came from decades of mismanagement. And really the only way to change that is through the political process. And the more informed folks are about what's happened to government and what the bill is, for 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road, notwithstanding anything to do with the coronavirus or COVID-19, nothing to do with that, just what the natural progression was going forward for these governments of the decisions they were making. That's kind of the important thing in separating the two events. I mean, if they really want to do something to help in the coronavirus situation, that's a different topic than this notion of, as Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. They've got a crisis developed, and now they're trying to paper over decades of mismanagement to get taxpayers to bail them out from states that were fiscally responsible. I think that's the important thing. And you'll hear the sad stories about, we're at to lay people off. Well, unfortunately, in the private sector, that happens all the time when markets change and demand changes. So
yeah, exactly. It goes to moral hazard and the idea where if you privatize gains but socialize losses in the private sector, for example, that is to say, a company benefits when they make profits and so forth, and they get to keep that. But when there's a crisis and then we bail them out, that's essentially socializing the losses. And in essence, that's what you'd be doing here for these states, and then saying, anytime you need a bailout, in essence, you can just count on the federal government. Not a good thing. But since you've twice mentioned Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste, let's hear him say it.
You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that, it's an opportunity to do things that you think you could not do before.
So he says serious crisis, but he said
It's
good
serious,
crisis
yeah.
too.
Sorry,
but,
Jimmy.
No. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's serious. That was 2008. I think during the 90s, he was saying good crisis. Hillary said that. I mean, it's the main refrain from Rahm Emanuel, but we hear many people. And that's an important point, that they always look to a crisis and find it as an opportunity to grow the size and scope of government with new expansive programs or spending initiatives.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a final question, and that would be national right to work, since you are the president of the National Right to Work Committee. Just sum up for those who aren't familiar with the concept of the right to work, what that is, and give us a quick synopsis of the state of affairs as far as states that are making sure that this is a priority in law.
Yeah, Jimmy, it's real simple. The right to work principle is we believe every worker should have the right to join a union, to choose to financially support a union if they want to, but no one in America should be compelled to join or pay dues to a private organization, i.e. a labor union, as a condition of keeping a job. Today, 27 states protect workers from being forced to pay dues or fees to a union just as a job condition. We passed 5 new right to work laws in the last 8 years. We won a U.S. Supreme Court case in 2018 that frees every government employee across the country, from the lowest level to the highest level of government, from being forced to pay fees to work for their government. So the progress is good. The state of the right to work movement is good. We've got lots more work to do, obviously. Union officials don't take this laying down. In fact, we just settled a case today on behalf of 263 employees in the emergency service business in Michigan who were being forced to pay dues, even though the state has a right to work law, forced to join the union. So we litigate for employees across the nation. We help to legislate in states to pass new right to work laws. And over the last decade, it's been a good time for freedom in the workplace, but there's obviously plenty of work to do. And the stakes couldn't be higher come November, because we have a presumptive nominee in Joe Biden who said he wants to repeal every right to work law in the country. And the House representative passed a bill in February that said they were going to repeal every right to work law in the country, forcing every American worker under a regime where they could possibly be forced to pay dues to a union to get or keep a job.
Yeah, in essence, the right to work is the way to prevent people from being forced to do something or to be involved in an organization that they don't want to. How many states have right to work laws currently?
27 states now, Jimmy.
More than half. That's not bad, but not where we need to go. All right, Mark Mix, president of the National Right to Work Committee. Great to check in with you, sir. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you. Good to be on with you.
Once again, Mark Mix joining us, National Right to Work Committee. Very interesting point of discussion, not just about the bailouts and whether or not we should bail out states, but also the whole issue of right to work and the importance of making sure that individuals are not forced, especially in government, but also in the private sector, are not forced to join a union organization that oftentimes, by the way, is doing things politically that they don't want to do and participate in. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.